Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore, I am. This is a key component of contextualizing the antagonist in Harlan Ellison's I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, showing a hyper-competent AI becoming sentient and coming to its own disturbing conclusions about the human race, and doing what it believes to be morally and emotionally right. I couldn't help but notice the same feelings of dread, urgency, and utter hopelessness that I felt whilst reading I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream in the USS Callister, Season 4, Episode 1 of Black Mirror.
This is a dream. Here, it has to be.
It's more like a eternal waking nightmare from which there is no escape.
Yet at the same time I always saw Black Mirror as a highly original show, and yet even with an episode that isn't, it still manages to steal like an artist. It expands on the ideas in Ellison's work, and contextualizes them in the signature oxymoronic Black Mirror style of overt subtlety. I promise that makes sense if you've watched the show, believe me. This is going to be a comparison of the situations echoed in both works, which will mean some heavy spoilers. So I highly suggest both watching the USS Callister, being one of the better episodes of the show in my opinion, and reading I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, which you can find a PDF for just by googling it, and it's only 13 pages long. I want to clarify something before I begin. There are two sets of victims that I will be discussing, and I'll name them appropriately. Daly's victims are the crew, and AM's victims are the survivors. Daly and the crew show themselves to be ideas expanded upon in I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, as I've mentioned, Daly being AM, and the crew being the survivors. I say expanded upon because the characters don't follow their Ellison counterparts exactly, but the core of the story is still here. I'll start with the clearest comparison in my eyes. Robert Daly and AM. Robert Daly is a sick man. Nanette and the rest of the crew know this not only through the nature of their situation, but his blatant abuse and torture of their digital selves and their minds. AM is also sick in a similar way, a hatred that both characters can only boil down to seeing those they hate suffer to exert control. To AM, humans were and are a pestilence upon its earth, but are also integral to its own survival to entertain itself, otherwise it would be a ruler of nothing. Daly uses the Space Fleet mod and the crew as a release for his infuriating existence in the office. With his own lack of willingness to interact and develop his social skills, he essentially ostracizes himself, because he does not know how to handle genuine interaction. He treats his crew how he wishes he could treat their real-world counterparts. He calls them disgusting and disgraceful, and judging from AM's actions and nature, it appears they feel the same way about their respective victims. As for the crew as a collective, their nature is similar to that of the survivors, with a slight difference that leads them to the same feeling of hopelessness expressed in Ellison's writing. The survivors are kept alive by AM. They can be beaten and tortured half to death, they can starve without dying, and are generally considered by Ted to be immortal. The crew are seemingly the same way, judging by Walton's sacrifice, in which he is inferred to have sustained burns that should kill him but don't, due to the nature of the mod. But there is one crucial difference. They can be brought back from death by Daly due to the DNA he stores in his mini-freezer. So without getting rid of it, the crew are immortal. Even if their digital selves die, there's no guarantee of escape. But they are able to enact a plan that should kill them by going through the wormhole. As to whether the Space Fleet mod would store the consciousness of its occupants and implant the memories into a new copy of their digital selves, or an entirely new consciousness would be created is up for debate, as we never see it happen. But judging by Walton's reaction to Daly bringing his son into the mod, the threat is more than enough to keep them afraid. The only way for both the crew and the survivors to die is by their own hands, and taking advantage of the environment. For the crew, this is the wormhole, and for the survivors, these are the ice spears in the caverns at the end of the story. The USS Callister ship itself is analogous of the environment in which the survivors live, the so-called belly of the beast, and its mile-long stretches of computer banks are seem to be deep in AM's so-called belly, and it's its domain. The USS Callister is Daly's domain, and the crew cannot escape unless he condones it, such as when they beam down to planets. The ship is also filled with computer consoles and tech that the crew are unfamiliar with, much like the computer banks seen by the survivors. The technology that Daly and AM wield contribute to both their power and to the terror of their victims. Isolated instances of technological superiority being used as torture would not be enough to beat both sets of victims down into the state they reside when we as viewers and readers join their story. It has to be consistent. Daly shows his disdain with more than just words in the same way that AM does. He strangles Walton and calls him pathetic through no fault of Walton himself just because he can, brought on by his interruption in the office. which he sees as literally stealing the net from out of his office. AM demeans Benny in the book by altering his appearance to that of a chimpanzee-like biped with giant genitalia. This demeans Benny in the same way as Walton, as well as Shania's transformation into another unnatural and cruel form, being a nod to Benny himself. Terror instilled by the threat of what happens when they break the rules in both sets of victims convinces and amplifies the hopelessness and apathy. If you try to kill yourself, I'll torture you. If you don't provide me with an immersive experience to deal with my problems, I'll torture you. There are character-specific examples of both works in Ted and Walton. They both feel that escape is impossible. Ted is shown this by AM violating his head and telling him exactly why they will never escape his grasp. He would never let us go. We were his belly slaves. We were all he had to do with his forever time. We would forever be with him, with the cavern-filling bulk of the creature machine, with the all-mind soulless world he had become. Walton seems the most hopeless of the crew, due to Daly using Tommy's death by airlock to scare him into taking the torture, so he doesn't have to see his own son die in space over and over again. Ironically, both Walton and Ted end up being instrumental in bringing the victims out of their awful situations while sacrificing their own well-being. Ted realises there will never be any more than AM's playthings, and takes the opportunity to end it for the other 4 survivors by killing them. As a result, Ted is transformed into a hideous globulous form in which he has no mouth and must scream, whilst Walton restarts the engines when the ship loses thrust during their escape attempt, so the crew can proceed through the wormhole whilst he himself burns up inside the exhaust of the ship. Walton is also not shown coming back onto the bridge after the crew make it into infinity proper, which lends itself to my personal theory that the force of the thrusters burned him up and jetted him out into space and is stuck in the deleted Space Fleet mod along with Daly. Either way, Ted and Walton do not see a happy end compared to their comrades, sacrificing themselves for their companions. I won't be delving too deeply into the themes echoed by both Brooker and Ellison as, quite frankly, I'm still learning to critique, and I'm sure there are others that would do it better. I'll just touch on things that stood out to me. Both works ask us what it means to hate. Real, seething hate that courses through every part of somebody, rather than the way we quite liberally use the word today. AM has a disdain for humanity due to his view of their negative and parasitic effect on the Earth, slowly killing it, thanks to pollution and their affinity and familiarity with excessive conflict, causing it damage. Due to its programming, this infers a twisted love that AM has for the Earth, assuming that it was developed in line with deterrence theory. What we see Daly's limited time with real world Nanette develop into is a disturbing infatuation, but infatuation can often feel indistinguishable from love to those with underdeveloped social and emotional awareness, as we see from Daly's submissiveness and general demeanour. On a surface level, Daly has a disdain for his colleagues as they mock his inability to socialise properly. But Daly's profound delusions shown in the Space Fleet mod, it is more likely that he has a deep hatred for himself in the real world, and the mod is used as a coping mechanism to convince him otherwise. And this leads us to the final theme of self-destruction. The creation of the nuclear bomb and the escalation of the Cold War leading to AM's creation progresses the extinction of almost all humans that never got the chance to grow beyond AM's initial impression of them. This was an act of self-destruction in hindsight, warning those of the wider and personal implications of technological warfare on our species. Black Mirror follows this same vein in almost all of its episodes. In the USS Callister, Daly's self-destructive nature is indicative in the way that he uses his Infinity mod to lower his stress levels, which would ultimately lead to his death. It prevents him from growing. He may be sick, but in Infinity he demonstrates authority and leadership with a confidence that is so far removed from his real-world persona. It begs the question that without Infinity to validate the feelings of hate towards his colleagues, would he have gotten help and become a more well-rounded and socially developed individual? But that's as speculative as I'm willing to get at this point. Black Mirror tends to be seen as highly original, because of its anthological nature, and the fact that it uses technology we have available to us and that will soon be available to us to tell a personal story. But even in an episode such as the USS Callister, when the premise isn't entirely original, Brooker still manages to steal like an artist, expanding on the ideas in Ellison's work and recontextualizing them in a way that is truly Black Mirror. Thanks for watching.
Could you please
Please cut that shit out.
I'm trying to make it like a hobby.